The Muslim Public Affairs Council held a series of panel discussions on bridging the divides in religion, race, and politics at their annual convention in Los Angeles. This panel examined discrimination against religious minorities in society and the courts. This is 40 Minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And so we're going to move right into our second discussion. This second discussion is titled Rethinking Religious Freedom. And I'm just going to very quickly introduce our fellow panelist discussioners. Asifa Quraishi-Landes is a professor of law at the University of Wisconsin, and her scholarship and research and activism focuses on Islamic constitutionalism, Sharia, and the U.S. Constitution. And Nate Walker, he's the executive director of an organization called 1791 Delegates, and it's an organization made up of legal scholars and practitioners who help companies, educational institutions, nonprofits deal with issues of religious liberty, religious literacy, and religious education. And so from there, I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with Nate. And Nate, could you walk us through just a brief history of religious liberty in the United States? Where did it come from? And then what are we seeing today in terms of a almost redefinition of religious liberty being what, from my perspective, used to be thought of as a shield, right? The Constitution and the amendments in the Constitution used as a shield for which the majority would not impose its views on the minority, but now almost being wielded as a sword by the majority. So if you could, I packed a lot in there, but if you could give it a shot.
Great. Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be with you all, especially in this time where the question of Muslims in America is the number one religious liberty issue of our time. This is a most pressing issue that we can trace back to the founding era, where you have thinkers and leaders like Roger Williams, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, all of whom in their writings articulate religious liberty rights for Mohammedans, for Muslims, even in those early times. And it was actually the diversity within the many Christianities that led to the creation of a constitution where there's only one mention of religion in the original constitution. And that is that there's no religious test for office. And yet now we're seeing, as we saw with Roy Moore, challenging Keith Ellerson's legitimacy. We're even seeing it with Dianne Feinstein and Bernie Sanders questioning some of judges based on their religion. So this religious test for office was a fundamental value based on the diversity of those at the table at the time. And then, of course, in 1791, you get the adoption of the Bill of Rights, which gives you the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. These are two principles that make up the one right of religious liberty. But what we've seen over time is that in the judicial system, religious minorities would bring up cases before the courts. And they would bring up many, many cases, but have low returns in their wins. To date, there has never been a Native American, Jew, or Sikh that has ever won a U.S. Supreme Court free exercise case. Never. It is 2000. Muslims won their first in 2015. Remember Samantha Eloff and Gregory Holt in those cases about Abercrombie and the Beard case? These are landmark moments in American history. But when you look at Protestant Christianity, now I'm speaking as a minister who trained in a Christian seminary in New York, you will see that as a Protestant, there's a de facto Protestant establishment in the United States. It has historically been very invidiously discriminatory toward Catholics, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, absolutely, with the genocide of Native Americans. And so with that, whenever Protestants would bring forward cases, they would bring up a low number of cases, but have high rewards. And so these are some of the patterns that we're seeing in the legal system that we all have to work against.
And then turning to you, Asifa, in your work on Islamic constitutionalism, Islamic law, Sharia, and I think this myth of the Sharia boogeyman, is coming and trying to take over the judicial systems of places like Kansas and Ohio, and these anti-Sharia laws and bills being introduced and actually signed into law by governors who are now senior officials in the administration. If you could walk us through where was some of the genesis of that? Did we thought maybe we overcame them, but now there's that threat has been reintroduced?
Well, we can't blame Trump. This anti-Sharia, how many have heard of the anti-Sharia legislation sort of movement? Most people know a little bit about it, or maybe a lot about it, but this has been going on since about 2010. So it's theorizing about what was the motivation, etc. I'll tell you what their ostensible reasoning is. But this is a fact check based on August of this summer, 120 anti-Sharia bills have been introduced in 42 states since 2010. In 2017 alone, 13 states introduced anti-Sharia bills, 2 of them, Texas and Arkansas, passing them. There happens to be one going through the system in Wisconsin right now. So who's doing this? What's going on? I mean, some of the organizations you may have heard of, you might want to watch. ACT for America is one of them. American Freedom Law Center is another one. Center for Security Policy, American Public Policy Alliance. They're also very, neutral. Some of the names associated with these organizations now have been seen in various Trump-related advisory positions. But like I said, this started before Trump. He just sort of adopted some of their rhetoric. Not surprising given the other rhetoric he's had to say about Muslims. So what's going on? Well, the argument is that this is to, quote, protect American citizens' constitutional rights against the infiltration and incursion of foreign laws and foreign legal doctrines, especially Sharia law. The first versions of these legislations, and some constitutional amendments actually, some of them actually use the word Sharia in the legislation. That was struck down in federal court as being targeting of a religion. You can't do that, directly targeting. So they've rewritten them to this neutral foreign law sort of thing, which, clearly you can see the motivation for what they mean when they say that if you just look at the advocacy behind it. So the idea here is some of the characters who have been behind this have said, well, this is the new stealth jihad. This is the new civilizational jihad. So the way Muslims are planning to take over, this is this idea that Muslims all want to take over the world everywhere they are. It's not going to be necessarily through physical violent jihad. It's this sneaking in, this Trojan horse kind of thing. And so this is a protection against that. Now, where is this coming from? I mean, some of the most early versions were criminalizing actual Sharia practice, which clearly, again, is a constitutional rights problem. But the cases they're citing where there's a problem. So most of the rhetoric in public is this is a myth. There's no problem. There's nothing going on here. These crazy arguments of parts of Michigan are under Sharia law. Yes, that's all false. But where are they getting the idea that there is this infiltration? Well, it happens to do with some of the areas that I've actually studied in family law cases where Muslims come into a family law situation. Some of them are inheritance laws, most of them are marriage cases, where they're arguing based on their Islamic marriage rights that they would like the judge to accommodate when they're doing the marital dissolution, for example. So the Muslims in the audience are familiar with the idea of a mahar. So a part of a required aspect of a Muslim marriage contract is that the wife is given a mahar, something of value. It could be money, it could be property that the husband owes the wife either at the time of the marriage or delayed to the time of divorce. So many of the family law cases, this is part of the litigation over how much was intended, has it already been given, does it get accommodated against the value of the house, for example. So this is the cases they've pointed to say, see, these secular American judges are enforcing Sharia law, and that's unacceptable from an American secular perspective. There was one case that they really like to cite, and that was where the system had basically misunderstood a cultural defense, where a woman wanted a restraining order against her husband for rape, actually, marital rape, and the trial judge misunderstood the cultural defense there. He said, I have a right to do this under Islam, so they didn't give her the restraining order. That went up on appeal, immediately was reversed and said, no, she has a right to a restraining order. So for lawyers watching this saying, see, the system works. Like, this is not a situation where Islamic law is taking over the basic individual rights of citizens. But nevertheless, that's an example that constantly gets cited. So I have some interesting, as an academic of constitutional law, I actually think it's quite interesting to think about what is the role of an accommodation of religious values in secular courts, for example. Is that something that we, our multicultural, multi-religious society, want to do? Does it have to be mutually consented between the two parties if they go to arbitration, for example, as very much in the Orthodox Jewish community? Is that okay? Are there limits to that? How far do we want that to go? Yeah, those are very interesting questions. But that's not the conversation we're having as a community. As a country, we're having a conversation of Sharia is trying to attack us and they're trying to sneak in. So you might have remembered just this summer in June, there were these big marches against Sharia. These happen every once in a while. And the population is starting to fear just the word Sharia as a bad, infiltrating kind of thing. So I just want to say, I'll say a little bit more and then I'll stop and we'll have a conversation. My first reaction to this legislation was, it doesn't matter anyway, because my work in the area of religious legal references in family court cases was the judges, well, they were all over the map for one thing, because it's state law based. And so some state judges accommodated these mahar requests and others didn't. But all of them had the basic principle that anything requested that was against American public policy or basic civil rights would not be accommodated. So that was standard. So this argument that somehow accommodating religious law is sacrificing our own public policy, public good, seemed irrelevant. So my first reaction was, okay, who cares? Yes, they shouldn't be passing these laws, but it's actually not going to have any tangible effect. Until a family law lawyer of mine, a friend of mine in New Jersey said, well, there's this Kansas case. So here's the language of this legislation. The legislation is basically that a state judge cannot accommodate, can't consider any foreign law that has, where's the language? Any law that would not grant the parties affected by the ruling or decision the same fundamental liberties, rights, and privileges granted under the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so that again sounds like you can't accommodate any law that violates basic principles of the U.S. Constitution. And it, by the way, applies to arbitration as well, not just a state judge. Okay, so there's this Kansas case from 2012 where the woman had a $650,000 mahar in her marriage contract. Nice work, sister. Or the dad of the woman, I don't know. Anyway, so she had $650,000. The court denied this, citing the anti-Sharia legislation that had just been passed in Kansas. And interestingly, they cited to an earlier Michigan case where the court had said there's something about Islamic divorce law that is unfair to women. It's weighted more for men, which it is. And so therefore, it's gender unequal. So therefore, this Michigan case wouldn't consider any claims about Islamic law in this court. Well, the interesting thing is the Michigan case happened before the Michigan anti-Sharia legislation. So again, this weird that the Kansas court would cite their Kansas anti-Sharia legislation and the Michigan case at the same time. But here's the thing. So we're not going to know all the cases that they go forward. A lot of these cases don't go into an appellate situation where it's published. A lot of people, who knows who's being pressured into giving up mahar based on the legislation that's been passed in their state that they'll never talk about it out loud. It'll be many years before we really get a landscape of what's going on. But what's happening is that some judges are looking at this anti-Sharia legislation with a stereotype of what Sharia is, that it somehow is fundamentally bad for women. That is one of the many underlying messages of Sharia in the country, that picks a few. So here's the question I have, is again a theoretical question. If there's any aspect of a legal system that's bad for women, does that mean you don't accommodate any part of that legal system? I submit that would be the case for U.S. law. Right? I mean, do you not accommodate any aspect of it? And the kinds of things they're denying are actually things, arguably, which are actually better for women than if she were to end up with a community property kind of arrangement, right? Community property actually goes against a lot of classical Islamic law values that a woman's property is her own property and cannot be owned by anybody else. So it's not true that always Islamic law always leaves a woman worse off than the secular law. So the idea that any aspect of this foreign law is counter to our values is irrelevant when you're looking at the particular aspect that the woman or the man is trying to request to be accommodated. So anyway, that's the point, and the conversation has to change in the public about what is Sharia, because the public conversation is that it's fundamentally bad for people, especially for women. I have a couple of suggestions about how we can change our narrative about how even Muslims talk about Sharia in a very limited education way. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it's unfair that now the average Muslim is supposed to know the highest levels of Islamic jurisprudence just to engage in a conversation with their local, grocery store clerk. But anyway, I have some suggestions. I'll give it later.
And we'll get to the solutions at the end. But suffice to say, Asifa, right, and I'm going to go to you after this, Nate, that the Sharia boogeyman is not what is kind of projected out for many people that don't know what even the proponents of these legislation are pointing to, right? It's not some kind of infiltration of the judicial system. In the few cases where it has come up, it's very narrow in this family law and actually divorce law setting where courts and judges actually have wide latitude in some states in how to, distribute the assets of a marriage, right?
Yeah.
So Nate, I want you to talk a little bit about the irony, about the forces behind these anti-Sharia laws, which are, in many cases, Protestant, white, evangelical, Christian groups. But those same groups were actually cited by now U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions as being some of his advisors in his latest Department of Justice guidelines on religious exemptions for a whole host of federal regulation and laws. So just in a nutshell, these new guidelines, in some instances, the federal government is saying it is okay to discriminate if you bring a religious objection, even though we have certain types of anti-discrimination laws. So I want you to talk a little bit about that irony, and then to tee up a case that's currently before the Supreme Court, which is bringing religious liberty back into the forefront of a potential landmark decision, and that's the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And if you could, set the scene for that very quickly, and what are some of the implications, and more importantly, and then this, I want you to talk about this, Asifa, is why should American Muslims care?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing we have to look is the big picture, and that is there is something happening to America that no other human civilization has experienced, as far as I know, in history. And that is, in 2012, Protestants, for the first time in American history, became a minority. That means we are a nation of religious minorities. No generation, no government has ever had the burden or the challenge of governing a nation of religious minorities. So when we're talking about these various things, the trend is this grief and fear of a loss of power and a majority status. And so that's where we're seeing, and another way to say it is in the Hobby Lobby case, if that owner were Muslim and brought forward to the U.S. Supreme Court saying it is my religious belief that I should not be required to pay for contraception to an insurance plan that would go to my female employees for contraception, he would have never won because he was Muslim, right? But because he was Christian, it's a legitimate claim. So this is the irony that we're facing, and this is also the irony coming before the Supreme Court with the Masterpiece case. As many of you know, this is the question of can a baker, or in other cases, a florist or an innkeeper or a stationery shop owner refuse to participate in the same-sex couple's wedding by selling them a cake or having their stationery or having their wedding be on their community farm or something. And so in these cases, they routinely lose because of a very simple legal trend, and it has to do with race. In the 1970s, Bob Jones University began to admit black students. In 1987, they came before the U.S. Supreme Court and they said, we have a religious objection to interracial dating and marriage, and we will not allow any of our students have the married housing if they're in an interracial relationship. And therefore, because our religious beliefs, we don't believe we should uphold public accommodation laws or non-discrimination laws in higher education. The U.S. Supreme Court said no. There is a compelling interest to eradicate racial discrimination in education, and therefore you do have to do that if you're going to receive any federal aid. And they said, okay, we're not going to take federal aid, and they went off the grid, and they truly became a private organization. And they maintained that belief until 2000. They had a theological awakening, and they permitted interracial copulation. And so the question before the court now is, can a business owner who is required to uphold non-discrimination laws in public accommodation have a religious view and saying, I will not serve this couple in that context because of my views of marriage? I'm sympathetic to this in part because I have many conservative family members and friends who view my partner Vikram and I in a very different way than we see ourselves as equal citizens, and I know that they don't see ourselves as that. But my point is that is it true that my religious views can trump your civil rights, your constitutional rights? For me, the simple answer is in the Constitution. It's that second clause of establishment. And that is simply the cake baker can go to the church and say, I'm going to sell my wedding cakes through the church, and there will be a way for people to purchase those. The business is not harmed, but there's not the stigma of my partner and I walking into that wedding cake and then being refused service. And do I go to another baker? What if they refuse service again? Either we have non-discrimination laws or we don't. Either we have equal protection under the law or we don't. And we can have religious liberty, the shield of it, to protect that baker and his right of conscience by allowing him to engage in those activities in the church or in the mosque, right? And so I think that's where the balance is, whereas you were mentioning religious liberty is often used as a sword to cause another harm. Well, this is that common ground approach where liberty, true liberty, is a shield.
Asifa?
Why should we care? So we had a chat this week getting ready for this presentation, and I said in that conversation, I said, this is hard for American Muslims because it's very easy to get distracted by the substance of the litigation having to do with gay marriage. And so Muslims may have an instinct, those who are conservative Muslims who believe a certain way about gay marriage not being a Muslim practice, they instinctively may feel aligned with the cake baker. And there's a danger in that, and that is that the precedent of law that would get established could very easily, and given your description of who wins and who loses, probably very easily would be used against Muslims. So an individual cake baker may say, I believe Islam is a threat to the United States. It's my religious belief that I must try to reject this in any possible form and refuse any number of services. So here's what I want to say. We as Muslims do not have a full, deep understanding of our own complexity of how Sharia has actually worked in our history. It is not the case that we believe the government should enforce my particular interpretation of my religious practice. And this is a problem that comes from our contemporary nation-state phenomenon. So just a little blip. Historically, pre-colonial Muslim societies had two types of law in them. One was fiqh, which is the interpretation of scripture that leads to how do you live a Muslim life. And by the way, that was diverse inherently because the individual scholars articulating it acknowledged that they were fallible in that process. That's why we have multiple schools of thought, Hanafi, Shafi, etc. But that wasn't the only law that existed in these societies. There was also siyasa that was articulated by the rulers. They were not doing ijtihad of the scripture. They were making laws, at least theoretically, for the public good. And the laws that got enforced on the land were not a particular selection of individual fiqh and imposed on everyone. So we are failing our own history if we insist that the state is supposed to be enforcing my particular version of Islam on everybody. So this is why it is actually quite an easy step to say, wait, I may not want that in my life, but do I really believe that my version of my personal practice of how to live in God's way should be what the state enforces. If the state has decided that racial diversity, religious diversity, sexual orientation diversity is the public good, it is not a violation of my own Islam to accommodate that if I choose to live here. The very idea of Sharia is Muslims live under the law of the land that they're in, unless that law is forcing you to either do something prohibited or preventing you from doing something mandatory, right? So unless they're keeping you from praying or forcing you to drink, you accommodate. So this is, I think, we need to go back. This goes to how do we understand Sharia? We have to understand that Sharia itself is not monolithic. Don't use the word code. It is not one code. Don't even use the word law, because in the public mind, law sounds like something the government does. That's how we think of law. That's actually not a good translation of Sharia. Sharia comes in many forms and many aspects, and parts of it are enforced by the state, and other parts are my personal practice. So don't get distracted by the substance, and don't identify with the plaintiff always, because that law could turn against you very quickly. So try to keep thinking in terms of the macro justice for everyone, and I think we'll all be better off, and we'll incorporate respect for each other much better that way.
Thank you. So this is, and I know I just want to do a time check. So if Nate and Asifa, if you could kind of offer some of your experience in what does from the state level, from the community level, what does implementing religious freedom really look like? And how do we as communities of faith, and I know in this room today and the work that MPAC does is engaging with, communities of many faiths and no faiths. What does that look like what should that look like in America today? And what are the opportunities for that bridge building, which we're all gathered here today to kind of figure out within this realm of religious liberty? Where are the areas that we can work together, build coalitions around, and actually show to the rest of the society, and this is a general trend, and Nate, you can talk about this, that people are leaving faiths, right? Whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Judaism. And, we had a meeting earlier today with our advisory council with people from many different faith background and faith leaders. And there was an anxiety that was expressed by many people of, well, what do we do because we're losing our young people from faith? Where does this idea of religious liberty be able to kind of galvanize communities of faith and no faith towards doing good work? And then Asifa, if you could talk about some of your recommendations of how we can better understand the Sharia as Muslims to help keep our youth, our community intact around an idea of Sharia that is closer to what we've kind of experienced throughout Islamic history.
So one way to conceptualize religious liberty is to just chant this phrase over and over and over, and that is, I am not free until you are free. I am not free until you are free. That is true liberation. And so in this context, when I was serving as a minister in Philadelphia, there was an incident where an attorney actually came forward in the paper and said, we need to ban the burqa. And here's why. It is a security issue, as the earlier panelists were saying. And so I came forward to give my thoughts on this, and I said, look, there is a very serious trend happening every December all around the country. It involves criminal activity of kidnapping, of vandalism, of all kinds of horrible things, taking theft and so on. And there is one trend that is occurring in all of these cases, and that is the criminals are all wearing Santa Claus outfits. We need to ban Santa Claus outfits. That's the solution. This is the idea of the basic hypocrisy, thank you, of how one can be blind to one's own liberty. If I do not fundamentally chant, I am not free until you are free, then I can buy into the idea that, oh, that criminal who is in that Santa Claus outfit, no problem. That doesn't say anything about Christianity. That doesn't say anything about that holiday season at all. That just says something about the criminal, because I know the difference between what the criminal does and what the criminal wears. Imagine if our society had the same sophistication with when anyone starts to say ban the burqa, ban the burkini, ban the hijab. In my dissertation on these types of laws, I found that there were 22 states in American history that banned public school teachers from wearing religious garb in the public classroom. Why were these all created? To ban Catholic nuns from teaching in de facto Protestant public schools. In Oregon, for instance, it was the leaders of the KKK that brought this law forward. Now, to date, there's only one state left that has this anti-garb law, and that's Pennsylvania. And what we're seeing in the modern times is that this disproportionately has harmed Muslims and Sikhs. But historically, it came from an anti-Catholic bias. This is what it means to say, I am not free until you are free. It means to know thy history. It means to know who is the suspect minority of the day and to see which patterns are being replicated so that when we go to the public square, we can participate in the legal education, in the religious literacy education, so as to, if nothing else, stop being hypocritical. And that's what our society needs most right now.
So if you'll indulge my little Sharia 101 here. So here's the questions I usually get asked when I give intro to a Sharia kind of presentations to non-Muslim audiences. One, they'll keep saying the phrase Sharia law. So that's my first thing. Don't call it Sharia law. Like I said, the word law implies that that's what something the government does. So if I say I practice Sharia or I support Sharia, if you say Sharia law, they think, oh, you want the law to be, all of American law to be Sharia. So you're already weighting the conversation against yourself when you do that. Muslims in the audience know that it's not what the government tells me to do. Why I follow Sharia has nothing to do with what any government tells me to do. So what should you say instead? There's a bunch of possibilities. You can say just Sharia, you can say Islam, you can say Islamic practice. I like Muslim religious sciences, that kind of nice Islamic way, something like that. Okay, so here's the questions I get. So I'll explain, and then I'll hear, but in, and then insert your favorite Muslim majority country. They do X. So Iran, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Pakistan, whatever, pick one. And here's what I answer. I say, that is the law of that country. That is not Sharia. But then the response will be, but they got it from Sharia. And I say, no. They may have grabbed one interpretation from many multiple interpretations of Sharia, but that doesn't happen to be the only one. But then they'll point, well, right here in this book, this Muslim scholar or this fatwa that I read somewhere, and by the way, this is highly well-funded. They cite the same things. They've got the same post-it notes in the same books when they come to heckle me. So this is organized. If you're interested in the whole money behind this, go look up the book Fear Inc., and you'll hear the whole background. All right, so this book says this. And so here's what I say. I say, that's interesting. That's one fiqh interpretation. It's not one that I follow. But don't you have to follow a fatwa? Like, we've heard of these fatwas. There's idea that fatwa is like you're like there's some automaton like chip in my head that I'm going to now go and follow this fatwa. And so here's my answer: no, we don't have a pope. I can ignore or follow whatever fatwa I hear. Fatwas are not binding. They never have been. They are authoritative, respected, expert opinions on a legal question, but they have no binding force on Muslims. One that just popped up, I can't believe anything you say because Muslims lie. They practice taqiyya. How many have heard that? Yeah, that's a new one. If you're Shia, it's not new, I'd like to say, because the Sunni community has been using this against our own Shia community for centuries. So it's a little bit of chickens coming home to roost for us Sunnis here. But the idea of taqiyya is that if you're in a situation, well, first I say, well, then why are you talking to me if you think I'm lying? But anyway, if I'm not so snarky, I will say, look, here's the idea of taqiyya. It's in any moral system where if you are put in a situation where you can protect the life of yourself or another innocent person, would you lie? So I give the example: if you're harboring Anne Frank and her family in your basement or attic, and the Nazis come to your door and they say, do you have Jews in your house? You would say no, right? That's taqiyya. So I give that example because it's one that immediately resonates with an American audience. They understand it much better. And so that's the role of lying in Sharia. I still don't trust you. Your loyalty is to Sharia, not to the United States. Then I say, well, it is part of Sharia that I follow the law of the land where I am. Muslims have been minorities in non-Muslim societies since before the Hijrah, the date of the Muslim calendar, when Muslims went to Abyssinia to live with a Christian king. We have a history of respecting the law of the land where we are. It's part of Sharia. It's actually prosecutable in a Muslim country under classic law, Islamic law, if you commit treason or violence or something against a state that has brought you in as a guest. So my last point is, that's just my how do you answer these questions, just a public service announcement there. But on this thing about we're all minority religions, we're also very close to being all minority races. In this country. And this is something that we are wrestling with. So the comment this morning was we're still litigating the Civil War even now. The racial divide in our country is heightening and heightening and heightening, and the emotions are very high. I feel that Muslims should be the key to helping us figure out how to live with that level of diversity. Because we have always had diverse legal interpretations of God's law, right? Multiple interpretations where we not only lived with each other, but we respected each other even when the particular details were actually opposite to each other in practice. On something as important as God's law, right? We had multiple interpretations. And we were historically societies which could easily accommodate minority religious communities. Jewish communities, Christian communities could easily live under Muslim governments because we did not have a uniformity of law for these societies, but we had a mechanism by which individual communities could live with their own identity and values. It didn't uproot the whole system. So we should be the example, rather than Sharia being this boogeyman that we should all be afraid of. Maybe Sharia is actually the key, right? If we Muslims actually know and understand what Sharia is in our own history, in that it is inherently diverse, that we actually can teach how this happens. How do you live with knowing yourself but interacting with those who are different from you? This is like, you grow more when you interact with those who are different. That is also the history of Muslim law, Islamic law. Sharia always had the scholars interacting with each other, even as they disagreed with each other. So this is the message, that how can we take this forward and help and be a part of American society? It's not just, and I agree, join your local city council, do the kind of community service, yes. But also, if you're really understanding Islam, you should be an example of how to not be afraid of difference, because both American history and Muslim history have been at our worst when we tried to create uniformity and rigidity from the top down. And we've always thrived at our best when we could figure out how to live with each other with respect for that diversity. So go out and expose yourself to difference. And the thing is that you don't lose yourself when that happens. You actually grow from the experience and you keep your own values. It doesn't mean you're this is the thing. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my values if I talk to somebody who's different. No, I'll actually grow and become a deeper, fuller person, stronger in my values, but also stronger and deeper in my ability to respect differences.
Well, thank you, Asifa. Thank you, Nate, for this discussion. You can follow both of them online. They both are active on social media to continue this conversation. And Asifa is working on a book project about, so I just want to do the book plug.
Thank you. Well, it's not done yet.
Not done yet, but look out for a book on Islamic constitutionalism and some of the recommendations she's offered about how can we as American Muslims and communities of faith chart a progressive and way forward for American society. So thank you.
At that same event, a civil rights attorney and the head of a former white supremacist group talked about race and nationalism. This is 35 Minutes.
I want you to welcome Sammy Rangel and Connie Rice. Sammy is executive director of Life After Hate, which deals with victims who become perpetrators of hate and violence. And he is involved in a documentary called Healing from Hate, Angry White Men and the Rise of the Alt-Right. Connie Rice is of the Advancement Project, which deals with racial justice and the legislative a number of legislative issues, and has been sought out by key policymakers, including the Obama administration, in putting together a paper on 21st century policing. Our discussion revolves around the issue of race and nationalism. And I think that is the issue of our time. In other words, how race is creating or influencing conversations that put communities into a corner and that divide our country. And it makes it very difficult to have honest conversations about national security, about civil rights, about pluralism, about the economy even. So I'm just going to let you open with your remarks, and then we'll take it from there.
No pressure on the high-level conversation, right? Like, I want to dazzle you with my loquacious abilities after the last two panels. I just got to say, this guy right here is intense, right? Like, I've never met him, never seen him, but I was just like, I don't want to play chess with that guy. Never. Great. It was great. And thank you for having me here. It's just interesting. Just, I think a week, maybe just a few days more than that, we were at the Wise Up Summit in Washington, D.C. with Daisy Khan, also talking about very similar topics and ideas that are affecting many communities, but primarily the Muslim community. And I will just be upfront and say, you know, while I'm not new to service work and working with some very difficult populations that typically revolve around some sort of hate, violence, and then not to mention the impact of those lifestyles and those places that those things lead. I am new to the Muslim community, and so I'm constantly learning. I'm just absorbing and soaking up as much as I can, as well as the Jewish community. And one of the things I have to say is that as I was listening to how the Muslim community is being persecuted, it reminds me of a time when the Jewish community was being persecuted in almost word-for-word ways and laws in another country that eventually led to what we know now as the Holocaust. Having visited one of those places recently, it brought to mind of how similar things are today for many people. Not just one persecuted group. There are many persecuted groups here. And I was just in Orange County at one of the universities that were talking, and a woman mentioned that the way that this last election has turned out was really a massive effort to restore the original binary that was at the root of how this country was established. And I took that and I connected it with what I've been realizing in working with white supremacy for the last couple of years, in that what we're seeing right now is the backlash of 50 years of civil rights by people who are angry and who were dragged into the civil rights movement, kicking and screaming, who have now kind of regrouped and recovered from that and are now starting to reestablish that pre-existing binary. And so I didn't know if it was by accident or they were just saving that conversation for right now, but you know, I started working with, my original intention was to work with youth who had, you know, survived, you know, abuse and found themselves in trouble. How did I become the executive director of a organization that is focused on combating violent extremism from the far right here in the US? I simply followed the breadcrumbs. And as a social worker, I think that's your primary duty. And so here I am, following the breadcrumbs, and it keeps taking me closer and closer to the top of this country. And so understanding that, I think Life After Hate and all these other organizations out here, including Basic Community, has to have an invested interest in being a part of the solution, not just the conversation, but the solution, especially in the face of leadership that abdicates from its responsibility to draw a clear line on what I would say are basic human rights.
Thank you. Connie?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and send me your bills for tuition, the former two panels. The learning here is very rich. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and what I see going on right now, it's a great theme, bridging the divide. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but I want to be realistic. It's one thing to talk about bridging the divide when you can assume goodwill. The question is, what do you do about bridging the divide when fear and hatred are being weaponized to create power for a group or a set of groups that fear the loss of their privilege and the only deal that they've been offered? The folks you're talking about in this country, which was begun as a slaveocracy, the only thing that poor whites were ever promised was that they would always have higher social status than Africans and later African Americans. And so they woke up one day, found 50 years of civil rights, as you said, but also, and this doesn't explain the entire reason why we have the politics of division and hatred and fear, which focus mainly on immigration, Islamophobia, and the favorite boogeyman in the United States, which is African Americans. That has been weaponized. It has been infused with steroids. And so the conversations that we were having for the last 25 years, I think there's a different premise now. Because the division and the fear and the hatred are actually the point, because they are the platform as a vehicle for power, for people who feel that they're losing their power. And so what you're doing here in this conference is extremely important, because in my view, American Muslim communities and immigrant communities are going to be our salvation, because the vision that you're going to put together, not just to explain all of the stupid questions you've got to answer, you know, the sort of stuck on stupid, the African Americans are, how do you comb your hair, and, you know, stupid stuff like that, and don't you have to follow fatwas, you know, all of the dumb stuff that you get when tribes don't understand one another and we're not integrated. Right now, we have to ask, how do you actually create cohesion behind the great principles that this country stands for, and why immigrant groups have always wanted to come here? Rule of law, separation of powers, free press, equality, you know, just all of the tenets, e pluribus unum, of the many one. It's not of the one, it's e pluribus unum. And you are crafting a vision that doesn't just fight to preserve your place here in the United States, but you're actually going to be the key to solving one of the greatest fears against extreme violence. But I also think that the way we are narrow casting and focusing on Islamophobia and giving that a lot of oxygen, it is the key reason we are endangering ourselves. We are creating more and more of the problem. And the biggest threat in the United States right now is not the horrific attacks with cars or anything else in Charlottesville or South Manhattan. It is the extreme violence of the folks who have the guns in this country. It is the extreme violence. By narrow casting and focusing on exaggerating the threat that's posed by folks who have taken Islam and perverted it and have weaponized it. Instead, we're ignoring. We talk about Manhattan. Well, when you talk about London, Barcelona, when you talk about all of the places where we've had attacks by people who have perverted Islam and commit violence and murder in the name of Islam, but we don't include Vegas. We're probably not going to include the shooting today. Why? Because they were done by white men. And so I think that's very dangerous. Actually, white supremacy is the mortal threat to our constitutional democracy. So, Salam, when you ask the question, how do you bridge the divide? I think that not just having a conversation, not just doing our panels, not just updating our Facebook pages, not just marching. If we don't organize, this is a struggle for power to either install an autocracy or to preserve the precious freedoms in our Constitution. I think the Muslim American community is going to be the vanguard of solving not just the international crisis over violent extremism, but in this country, I think this community is the key.
Thank you. On the issue of white supremacy and white nationalism, Sammy, you deal with people who have gone through that process of radicalization, but they're white supremacists. And something that I've heard before in terms of dealing with people who have radicalized to violent extremism is that you can't look at them as monsters. You have to look at them as human beings first. Can you walk us through that process of dealing with people? Because I think, like yourself, and I watched your YouTube about your life story as a victim of rape and abuse growing up as a child. It was a very difficult video to watch, but it's a must-watch video. What goes on in the minds of people who radicalize along the lines of white supremacy, and what do you do to try to help that person?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that we can't fall for the trick of the rebranding of racism and bigotry under the guise of white nationalism or civic nationalism. We're talking about racism. And so I haven't met many criminals who acknowledge that they're criminals. I haven't met many racists who acknowledge that they're racist, or alcoholics who are alcoholics. Right? And there's always another word for it other than what it is. And so I think we have to be very careful not to allow the rebranding of what we're seeing from the far right be anything other than racism and bigotry and supremacy. If they want to call themselves white nationalists or anything else, that's for them. But we understand that we're dealing with supremacy issues rooted in racism that are really their ultimate goal is, genocide or, complete separatism and oppression of anyone else other than, right? And even has me wondering if I'm American, in the way that it's being talked about, in those many conversations we're hearing. And I do think it's important to acknowledge what happened in Texas and just, of course, waiting. Some of us are bracing to try to understand what happened there. I think no one should practice the values of the people that they're condemning and then see themselves as different. The reason I say that is because I think the previous panel talked about it to a degree, we are at risk of hating the people that hate us. And that will only create more of the problem and more of the justification for people to dig in on their opposite ends, if you ask me. The problem that we're witnessing from the left, so-called left side, is that people are tired of having to turn the other cheek. And so they're assuming that for the last 50 years, us being, the softies and the lefties, how they talk about people who are trying not to be violent. I think some people within that group have gotten fed up, and it's also a natural consequence of being repressed and oppressed for a long time, and for your voice not mattering. But I think we have to be careful not to cross over to that violence. Part of our failure is that we don't stick with causes long enough. And we're running out of ideas on how to resist that don't include violence. And so in many ways we're frustrated, and I think we're reacting out in that frustration. This is not a justification. I want to understand the left just like Life After Hate tries to understand the right. We're trying to understand what is driving people to such depths of anger and hatred, and then ultimately violence. Radicalization in many ways, I believe, comes from unresolved experiences of trauma, whether they're justified or not. How do we know if something's traumatic? Well, if the person feels that it was traumatic, right? And so, many ways, we're talking about a group of people who feel disenfranchised, who are still probably a group of privilege, but don't have full reign of that privilege under civil rights laws, right, and movements. And so they're feeling in some way that they're becoming the victims of civil rights in many ways. And there's that denial and that dissonance built into that narrative. But for us, we need to understand that that's their narrative. We don't have to agree with it. We're not giving away what we believe in, and we're not conceding to anything, but we're also not condemning in that way. And we know that that's an important aspect of the work we do, because in order to have dialogue, you have to have a sense of a shared experience created in the room with the person that you're trying to help. So if that person doesn't feel that you're sharing with them that space, they'll reject anything you have to say or anything that you offer, no matter how great it is. And so we're trying to position ourselves not in the middle, but we're trying to, in many ways, stretch our spirits around these issues so that we can envelop it. Rather than have to choose a side, we're trying to embrace the sides that are out there as a whole and understand that, look, this person is not irredeemable. This person is not broken beyond repair. This person can be reached. And we saw that in Gainesville. Life After Hate has been saying that with compassion and empathy, you can, in the face of hate, dismantle hate. But you can't respond in kind and then expect to have some sort of improvement. And so when we saw those two men hugging and then later become friends, we realized that that is in many ways what the individual community, the individual person has a responsibility to do. That doesn't again mean that you're conceding or relinquishing your position. It just means that you put humanity before your ego in many ways when we're addressing these issues. And you know, we are finding success. Life After Hate is made up of 100% former violent extremists who are now invested in doing the service work, you know, and in also trying to help others be redeemed in that movement.
Just real quickly, just a quick follow-up. You were awarded $400,000 grant by the Obama administration for countering violent extremism with white supremacy, and then it was rescinded by the Trump administration. What was the reasoning, the purported reason that was given to you, and what are you doing to offset that loss in terms of trying to do the work that is so important?
Absolutely. So we've been a nonprofit since 2011. In many ways, we're the only ones doing what we do in the country right now. And it was really just a small group of us who decided we wanted to unravel and undo some of the harm that we had caused through our own behaviors. And with the exception of myself, everyone else in Life After Hate is a former white supremacist. I actually survived a race riot at 17 fighting white supremacists. But here we are together doing this. And the reasoning was, and I think it's important to understand, I think what the real decision was hidden behind was that we no longer, after a new review, qualified for the funding. But that's like changing the questions but still grading it by the old answer sheet, and we were never given an opportunity to respond. However, I think that no one would be surprised when I say that the priorities by this administration to focus on white supremacy disappeared under the new election. And so that, I think, was just the final sweeping gesture of taking that off the table as a point of conversation. The data does not support focusing on ISIS-related type terrorism in this country. It's a factor of 2 to 1 that the majority of violent extremist attacks in this country, just since after 9/11, have been by far-right violent groups, not by men or women hiding behind some sort of religious component of Islam or faith related to Muslims. It has nothing to do with that. In many ways, I think that it's what's inspired Vegas. It's what inspires what we're hoping doesn't turn out to be related to anything that's going to cause more condemnation of groups of people here in Texas. They don't have to be a part of those movements to be inspired by those movements. If you've ever been around somebody in a bad mood and found yourself in a bad mood, you kind of understand the dynamic, but on a larger scale.